Rent control died here in Cambridge on December 31st, 1996, when time ran out for the last of the protected tenants. The story of rent control in Cambridge is a long one, more than 25 years old, but it's a very important one, and not just for us. At this moment, the state legislature in New York is debating whether or not to retain authorization for its rent control program and its rent stabilization law. And the arguments in New York sound as though they were lifted from the pages of our local Cambridge newspapers. Former City Councillor Bob Moncrieff has taken the time to produce a scholarly article which appears in the recent issue of the New England Journal of Public Policy. Over 2 programs, we'll look at the article and talk with Bob Moncrieff about the demise of rent control, the social and political implications of ending the program, and the discussion that appears to grow more rich with each passing year. Denise Jillson, who is the president of the Massachusetts Homeowners Coalition, also joins us. Bob, thanks for taking the time to join us. You've written a piece, I called it a scholarly piece. It's also a very informative one, and it minimizes editorializing in terms of individuals or taking positions about who was right and who was wrong. But why did you feel it was important to write a piece about the demise of rent control?
Well, it's one of these occasions where law and politics intersect, and I always find those things very interesting. And it was a very complicated story, and I just thought it would be a shame if it got lost. You know, nobody reading the newspaper every week tells you what happened that week, but it doesn't put all the pieces together. And you know, I'm a retired lawyer. I gotta have projects, and this sounded like a fun project.
No, there's the possibility that years from now, the only people left to tell the story will be the people who had a personal, political, or financial interest in it, and by then, the story starts to take on a life of its own.
Actually, when I undertook to do this, I'd never met Denise Jillson. I didn't know any of the players, but I knew roughly what had happened, and I just thought it'd be fun. That's the reason I did it, no other reason.
There will, as far as, you know, Glenn mentions that you don't get into the recriminations and the moralizing about who was right and wrong, but I'm sure that Marty would be willing to do a special episode devoted to that topic.
But a half hour wouldn't be long enough.
Okay. But there was, and we'll get into this, a series of very close legal opinions and a very close vote statewide, and the very close move to get the signatures. And each component of that is fascinating.
And they're all documented in the New England Journal of Public Policy, and we're going to talk about that. But first, take us back more than 25 years ago, almost 30 years ago, to a very critical period in the city's history. Bob Moncrieff was on the city council. Saundra Graham was one of the more prominent community organizers, soon to join the city council fighting for rent control. You were among the city councilors who voted to establish rent control in the city. Why?
Well, it was a very different time. Saundra will remember that. The year I ran for the city council was the year that the SDS occupied University Hall, and there was a bust, and Lyndon Johnson wasn't president anymore, but the programs that he had enacted as the Great Society were just beginning to bite. And I mean, it was a different world.
Advocacy.
I mean, people down there, and the landlords were wicked, and model cities was great, and the whole package. And it was like an avalanche. I mean, nobody studied anything. When I ran for the council in 1969, I never thought rent control was a very good idea. Even Barbara Ackerman, I think, would agree with that.
And I would agree too.
That
he didn't think it was a good idea.
I advocated in my campaign, you had to do something about rent control, that we have a rent stabilization board with which landlords would be required to pre-file intended increases, but that if the board, in accordance with such criteria as it developed, didn't intervene, the increases would go into effect automatically. Well, that was a non-starter. When the time came for rent control to come before the council, the state had given us an enabling act, and you could take it or leave it. You couldn't change it. So I was afraid I let the locomotive run over me. I'm not proud of the vote.
You know, the 1990 excuse me, 1970, 71, 72 was also a very highly charged period in local politics. A coalition of city council members had fired James Lee O'Sullivan as the city manager. He was popular with large sections of the community. I know that you supported him. I know that Saundra supported him when he returned to the city council. The firing took on an air of such controversy, allegations of corruption. The progressive community really was well organized. Frank Frizzoli was the controversial superintendent of schools, and the liberal community revolted against the Frizzoli administration. So the progressive faction in local politics was at one of its highest points. Certainly was able to mobilize enough support to elect a majority on the city council and make Bob Rackham mayor, which kind of justifies or explains the overwhelming support of rent control, which had the support of 6 or 7 out of 9 members in the city council?
I think never more than 6. I was never sure whether I was the decisive vote. I think not. I think Dan Clinton would have voted for it.
And
but that may be an excuse. I mean,
and you had CEOC, which is the Cambridge Economic Opportunity Committee, that was very active, organizing communities. So they was a major part of getting the community out and getting them active in the whole housing rent control.
well, every time you went to the city council chamber on a Monday night, there were 500 people there. I mean, it didn't make any difference what the issue was.
Well, and there were progressive endorsement entities like the so-called Cambridge Convention, which had more or less overrun the Cambridge Civic Association at that time.
And rent control was really for the people of Cambridge at that time. It was our community, Riverside, where Harvard had expanded and began to evict all of the community people who lived in that area. They bought up everything.
And Harvard expansion was a big issue in the University Hall takeover, as was rent control.
And that's where we're getting, you know, we can get off the track of the legal battle that ended it, but it was a gradual process, but it was from the time that it was put back in I guess, 1971, till its repeal, that it changed who it served.
Yes.
Because a landlord running a building found it a lot easier to put in a young couple with no kids and 2 good incomes, or a young professional, yuppies, et cetera, who weren't going to wear and tear the building and who would pay, given that the rates were low. So it ended up subsidizing the lifestyles of
the rich and famous?
The childless, if you will, in the professional. And there weren't a whole lot of families. There were almost no families moving into rent-controlled apartments the last 10 years we
The
had
arguments that are made now, or that were made in the latter stages of rent control in its favor, are quite different than the ones that were made at the beginning. The beginning, it was, let's protect people who were being trampled upon. In the latter stages, I mean, nobody with a straight face could make that argument anymore, because it was now, let's protect diversity, which is not people who are being trampled upon, but people who, for whom it's a little tough to live in Cambridge, and we want to keep them here.
But you know,
Can't drive a Saab if they had to pay rent.
Well, I mean, we can get into David O. Ives and others living in rent-controlled apartments, and the intelligentsia living there, and the glitterati. But really, the activists were now setting the dialectic. You had David Sullivan, who and others like him, who weren't admitting what they really believed, and John St. George. David Sullivan believed that everybody should be entitled to a rent-controlled apartment, and the Rent Control Board should function much like a Department of Public Utilities that regulates your telephone or your electric bill or the provision of natural gas. John St. George, who was a candidate twice or many times for Cambridge City Council, and whose mother was a saint, was the telephone operator at Cambridge City Hall. John believed that and a Harvard graduate, that if we could make the rent control system so onerous, we would make it unattractive for individual people to own properties, or business corporation to own real estate, and then we could do away with private ownership of property, you see, and it would become the domain of government.
There was
that kind of movement thinking. Believe me, this is true. I've had conversations with both of them about it.
There certainly was a faction, and when we talk later about the political campaign and the aftermath, there was a faction who fundamentally did not believe in the concept of the private ownership of property, and that may have helped with the entire demise.
I want to say a couple things about David Sullivan. He was not on the council when I was, although I think Saundra's
came later.
MIT.
he's a very, very nice man, and unlike, I think, I probably shouldn't say this, but I never had any question that his convictions about rent control came from the heart. I mean, he really did believe it.
For him, this
but
was not about
he
power.
was responsible
It was about social conscience.
for the change, the major change in rent control that occurred after the early 70s, and that was the prohibition of condominium conversions.
Right.
The original statute, which the legislature gave us and which we adopted, allowed a landlord to condominiumize his building and sell off units to individuals, and those units could move into those individuals could move into the units they had bought. David Sullivan was the driving force behind an ordinance in 1979 that changed all that. And after 1979, if you bought a condominium and you hadn't lived in it prior to a certain date, you couldn't live in it. Yeah, August 10, 1979. You couldn't live in it. You had to maintain it as a rental unit. It was a major change.
And one step further, one step further. If you did so, you were a criminal.
Yes.
It was a criminal violation of rent control ordinance.
Subject to $500 a day fine.
That's
And
where John Maddox came from.
and incarceration.
That's right.
There you go.
In the legislature, it gave SPOA and Mass Homeowners Coalition and others their best weapon
SPOA
to
being
tell
the
that story.
Small Property Owners
But
Association.
it wasn't also just SPOA. And I think what happened was the activists within the rent control unit had taken rent control on a different level. They were unwilling to bend over anything. I mean, and so what we had was small homeowners who couldn't get loans to fix up their properties. They were going down the tube. Some of them were what do they call it, non-habitable, because people couldn't get money to fix them up. And we was losing units that way as well. And the failure for the activists to look at a solution to that problem really caused the downfall of rent control, because SPOA and them couldn't get it together for a very long time.
Well, there wasn't any SPOA until 1987.
The 1979
I mean,
ordinance,
what's the name of the guy that knocked Tom Danahy off his seat? What's the real estate guy? Fred somebody? When they put that ABC or 1, 2, 3.
Yeah, great tactician.
There's an early referendum attempt to remove it.
I mention one more thing because I think it's important, and that has to do with the fact that when rent control was adopted, at least, I don't know about anybody else, I was just carried along in the rush. And none of us knew anything about it. There were some horror stories about some woman named Bertha Cohen, and there were some people in this part of Cambridge, in the West Cambridge, who had overpaid for buildings and who had to jack up the rents in order to service their debt. But we didn't know anything about it. And I remember the night that it was adopted, the legislature had just gotten through their enabling legislation, and it was on the agenda that same night. And Ed Crane said, "Can't we at least have a public hearing?" We did have a public hearing, but none of the distinctions were made. And I remember that rent control had been in for a very short time when I had a call from some woman on Columbia Street, which is not the high rent district.
That's right.
And I think it was a 6-unit place. And she had some hot shot down there, was paying $35 a month and thought he ought to be paying $33 or something. And he was giving her a terribly hard time, and she didn't know what to do. She kept her receipts in a shoebox. And that was the first time it dawned on me that maybe this wasn't for small property owners.
Again, just for the last time, going back to 1970, one of the voices against rent control on the council was former mayor and legendary city councillor Ed Crane, who opposed it, probably the city council's most visible opponent of rent control. He was concerned that if we adopted rent control, we would never get rid of it. He was pretty close to being right. He was also an individual who he left the city council after the term which passed rent control, gave it up, and in fact, with his opposition to rent control, may have alienated the Cambridge Civic Association and may have alienated a portion of the constituency that had been with him for a long time, namely those loyal to the Cambridge Civic Association. Looking back, does Crane look like a wise old man of Cambridge politics?
Well,
or
in
did he look-
retrospect, it seems to me he was right on that issue. I don't think there's any mystery to Crane's view. I think he just thought it was bad social policy. And what he would have done if he thought he was going to run again, I don't know. My guess is he would have done the same thing. After all, his vote had already been badly reduced by prior events. I mean, he's the only guy, I think, who's ever gotten double quota on number ones. And he had a pretty secure base. I just think he thought it was poor public policy.
Well, and then not to beat this, but the proof was that over the years, moderate attempts, vacancy decontrol, I would argue, was even moderate, but even lesser things like allowing the rent control allowed owner-occupied 2s and 3s to be exempt, while allowing 2 or 3 units in a 4 or 5 or 6 family to enjoy that exemption. Lots of small steps that would have brought a little capital into a landlord and that sort of stuff. Nothing could get touched. I mean, David Clem promised to have an open mind and got steamrolled in the.
Well, I think David Clem, if I recall, I think he advocated broadening the exemption for small property owners. Didn't need to
Yes, he did.
4s or 6s.
Yes.
And they just
And
murdered him.
here's what makes, here's
Well,
the unique,
before he got murdered, he decided to quit.
politically murdered.
Politically. See, the problem was that
He's
you
still
couldn't,
alive and well,
you
or-
just couldn't touch rent control in the form that it was.
Well, let's explain
And that
why.
was the very hard part.
We
And
in
that's what the
Cambridge,
demise was. I mean, really.
Well, the combination of, and we can't ignore this, rent control would probably not have survived as intact but for proportional representation. Slate voting created the kind of situation. I saw it. I lived in a rent-controlled building for a while, and people went in from that building. They didn't know they didn't know that whether the mayor was elected straight. They didn't know what the schools were. They knew nothing about the city, but they took a tenant slate. How do I go in and vote? I'm going to take 10 minutes out of my schedule every 2 years to save my cheap rent. And
now,
that was all they did.
fortunately, the public interest in this program, which is going beyond Cambridge to New York City, in fact, New York City voters may appreciate this explanation. We in Cambridge use a very unique system to elect our local officials that is only used elsewhere in this country to elect the district school boards in New York City. We list candidates numerically in the order that we prefer them, and you need to get number 1 votes. You also need to get transfer votes from those candidates who don't have enough number 1s to stay in the race and who give up their votes to people listed 2 and 3 on the ballots. Therefore, the slate and the slate card becomes very, very important. And the tenants immediately, the tenant interest immediately took over the Cambridge Civic Association, dominated the CCA, and put together their own slate, which managed to hold the city council hostage.
Well, remember, they did so with a minority of the 9. They needed that crossover vote for Al Vellucci. And there are 2 points I want to make. One is that in the 25-year history of rent control, there was only one so-called reform, and that was the sabbatical leave reform.
Yes.
This was a sop to the university affiliates who owned a unit and who were, quote, going away on sabbatical.
That was Frank Duhay, Alice Wolf. Bob, was you there then? No. Alice Wolf.
They were allowed the only, quote, reform. The only change was to benefit essentially people who were going away on sabbatical. They were allowed to rent their units at market rents. The second point, which was a travesty, but be that as it may, that's my own editorial comment. The other thing is I had someone told me a story from the other side of the river. He was president of the Greater Boston Real Estate Board at the time and was asked to come to testify before the Cambridge City Council about rent control and its unworthiness as a public policy tool. And he was being examined by none other than Mayor Vellucci. I don't know if he was mayor at the time, but he was being cross-examined. And he was asking why the witness, why there was the need for rent control, and what was the cause of it. And the witness kept giving explanations about the causes, and none of them, well, what other reasons were there? Those weren't the reasons that Mayor Vellucci wanted to hear. So finally, he slipped a message to him, had someone run over and slip a message to him. And he asked him again, what is the reason we have rent control? And then the witness opened up the message and it said, say Harvard.
Al Vellucci, of course, being a multi-decade,
absolutely true.
city councilor who provided the swing vote between the traditionally liberal Cambridge Civic Association, the more conservative independents or non-Cambridge Civic
It's
Association
interesting why that's
councillors.
so, too. But Bellucci was, of the independent candidates, he was always the hero of the West Cambridge liberals, not because necessarily rent control, but because how he felt on many other kinds of issues that West Cambridge liberals were interested in.
But what you really didn't
and
understand...
he took these positions because every
Because
so
the
often,
CCA would
for
occasionally
CCA would
make
make
him
him
mayor.
mayor.
If it
Exactly.
votes.
That's exactly.
Well, the other piece of that...
The rigidity of the tenants that we were just talking
Yeah.
about, and the total inability to look at any kind of a reform is ironically, it's like pressure valves. You have to let off a little steam or the pipe will burst. Well, that's just what happened here. That rigidity and inflexibility resulted in the entire rent control structure being undermined in Cambridge.
Denise ought to
It
address
got
this.
killed.
I have the feeling that if Clem's reforms, if we call them that, had gone through, there wouldn't have been any
That's
control.
what I'm
We're
saying.
grateful to the tenants and to
Did
the
anyone
council.
do more to end rent control than the Cambridge Tenants Union?
Nobody, and maybe the city council, But we were grateful to them because had there been reforms, we would have probably not tried. We would have gone home.
And the 1979,
We would have stayed home.
The 1979 ordinance
said.
created a class of martyrs, people who either knowingly or inadvertently bought condominia without being aware of the fact that it was illegal for them to live in them. And
Oh,
some
that's
people,
a lie.
some people,
That is
well,
a
but
total lie. That is a lie.
But
That
they
is a
did.
lie. That is
but
a lie.
1,500 of them or more.
That is a lie.
But there were 1,500
Oh,
people
no, Glenn,
living in
Glenn.
condos that they were not
No.
allowed to occupy.
But you thought they knew what they were
They
doing.
knew exactly what
Okay.
they were doing.
There were more than 1,500. And Saundra,
Yeah.
you're right. They
Okay.
did
That's
know.
right.
So there
They
were
did know.
2,000
And the real estate agents told them exactly what to do, and
Set up
those
a-
who
So
were
there,
in those...
and as Bob explains, there are 2,000 people living in condominia which they owned, sometimes under a trust structure, which legally they were not entitled to be able to do. However, as much as they may have gamed the system, to those outside the city, they were people who were denied the right to live in their own
It was a
homes.
very good argument.
one
It was a
other
good
aspect
argument.
Created a class of martyrs.
In these buildings, this 1979 ordinance caught some of these
Caught so many
buildings
of them, yeah.
that were in the process of
They
being
were hybrid.
condominiumized. Some of the people had already bought their apartments
That's
and
right.
moved in, and they were
That's right.
fine, and the others couldn't be occupied. So you had what they call these hybrid buildings, where half of them were rental units and half of them were, and of course the landlord ones who couldn't move into their units had different goals
That's right.
than the people who owned their units. And when it came to voting for capital improvements and so forth, the people who owned their units
Didn't do it.
couldn't get the vote that they need under the condominium
The
statute.
Small Property Owners Association, which you headed at one time, had among its core of most zealous workers the smaller of the property owners and the ordinance condo people
Yes.
who went out and
Not too many ordinance condominium people because they were really fearful.
they were laying low.
They were laying very low. It wasn't until probably the beginning of 1993 when the Rent Board took action against some of the ordinance condominium people, and they went out and they were looking at mailboxes and checking, car registrations and doing certain things. And that's what really prompted John Maddox, because he had been living in his unit for several years, and there was some indication that his building was one building that they were targeting, because they were targeting certain buildings to check to see whether there were actually people living in their units. And that's, John started thinking, $500 a day fine times 5 years, it's a significant sum of money. And he came to me in May of '93 with the idea of the ballot petition.
By the way, another point that you make in the article is that the state legislature in 1976 changed the rent control enabling legislation to preclude certain kinds of reforms, rent stabilization,
It
for
didn't work
example.
quite that way, Glenn. In 1970, the state legislature passed a general enabling act that any city or town could adopt. And that was the only kind you could have, and Cambridge adopted it. But it had a limited life, and it ran out in 75 or 76. And after that, every municipality that wanted to continue rent control had to go back and get their own special act. And I think the Cambridge Act that they got was really just a continuation of what they'd already
Yes,
had.
that's what it was.
But
As a matter of fact, Cambridge and Brookline both got a continuation of what they had.
Yes.
Boston got vacancy decontrol at that time. Subsequently, Brookline amended theirs. So Cambridge was the only one that had never changed theirs.
You know, in my view, it's just to get back to Al Vellucci for a minute, because it's only in recent times that the so-called progressives have had a protracted dominance of the political terrain. Rent control was maintained in the city for almost 20 years only with Al Vellucci's vote. I mean, maybe it required your vote or potentially Danny Clinton's vote to bring it here, but to keep it, it here, Al Vellucci, and I've always equated rent control in Cambridge with Al Vellucci. But to prove your point, the minute he strayed from the reservation, he was punished politically, and actually it was the end of his political career. What he did was, his wife was ill, and he decided to give up voluntarily his city council seat and not run for re-election. And when he did, he no longer had the obligation to the tenants. What he did was he voted for a so-called reform, which was a very complicated reform that affected a certain number of units, 200-300. It basically involved where there was a conflict between the zoning ordinance and the building code and the rent control board, it would be resolved in favor of the zoning ordinance.
That was one of those conflicted properties.
So what happened was, in times past, if you had a 3-unit building, you might fix up a unit in the basement. Now it's a 4-unit building and no longer exempt from rent control, but in violation of the zoning ordinance. Vellucci voted for a council order that served as a solution to that problem. When he decided to come back and run for election, the tenants punished him because he had voted for this, quote, reform. So his one vote, after 20 years of loyal support in keeping rent control here, cost him his political career.
And you know, it was a stupid move, because if they had just looked at the people who were involved in SPOA at the time and determined how many of those people had conflicted properties, if our issue had been resolved, maybe we would have walked away. And maybe, just maybe, that would have been the end of it.
But the campaign to end rent control needed SPOA. Now, you worked out of Doug Thayer's office. And Doug Thayer is a large property manager and landlord in Cambridge. But Doug Thayer has a staff, he has live-in superintendents, they keep track of all their expenses, it's probably computerized, et cetera. Elio Centrella, my barber on Mount Auburn Street, owns one 4-family house on 6th Street. David and Aileen Sullivan, I believe, had one property on Chilton Street. It's hard for someone who owns one property, works another job, has a life, raises children, et cetera, to keep track of every cost, every piece of tile, every fuel, every time you fix the roof and so forth. So they don't have the volume, they can't amortize the cost of going to the rent control board, legal counsel, and all that.
And that created a whole series of problems which led to a gentleman named John Maddox.
Right.
And when we resume this 2-part program next week, we'll talk about John Maddox and the electoral campaign to end rent control. Thanks for being with us. We'll see you next week on Cambridge Inside Out.